of the state of Israel in 1947 after the Second World War. So 1947 is where we've kind of left things. So the British, us, we've had enough. We've turned to the UN for help on how to deal with the whole Israel-Palestine situation in the Holy Land and how states can be created. We were eager to ease relations with the US. America would get increasingly angry with us after the Second World War for not relinquishing our power. The whole kind of favor of the world was towards the Jews at this time, because it's just post-Second World War. The Holocaust is still very kind of raw and recent in everyone's memories. The UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, was established in order to effectively deal with this situation. So what really kind of sped along the British removal from Palestine was the arrival of 4,500 Jews from Europe in the port of Haifa on a ship called the Exodus. Palestinians they saw this boat coming in and they were angered that their land was now being used to solve what was seen as effectively a European problem, because most of the Jews arriving from Europe, most of the Jews arriving were from Europe. And the Palestinians refused to engage with the UN. And this is something over the concurrent decades they would repeatedly do, is refuse to engage with any partition plans or any kind of advice or plans of the UN. The British, in order to try and appease the Palestinians, sent back this boat, the Exodus, with the 4,500 Jews. And that backfired catastrophically, as you can imagine. The whole world was furious that the British would do this. They were like, why on earth would you not sympathize with the Jews? Why are you sending them back to Europe? And then at this point, the British were kind of like, all right, well, that's it then, screw that. It's your problem. You deal with it. And so they began to move out very fast at that point. Now, the UN had two proposals in terms of partition. One was to create a federal state where there would be some states where Arabs would live and some states where Jews would live. But it would all be one country. This, however, was very unpopular. The other idea was revitalizing the Peel Commission plan, which I remember from last week, which was to partition the area entirely. So one whole area would be Jewish, the other whole area would be Arab. This was by far the more popular decision, which surprises me because I would definitely have voted in favor of the federal idea. But anyway, so what you have here on this first map is the proposed 1947 UN partition plan. So, and if you're interested, the tally was 33 in favor of partition plan and only 13 in favor of a federation, with 10 abstentions. Britain also abstained from the vote. Just as to further show that we're washing our hands of the whole situation. This was called Resolution 181 and was far more Zionist than even the Peel Commission proposed. So you might remember the Peel Commission, that earlier British piece of legislation to accommodate both Jews and Arabs. It was very sympathetic towards the Palestinian plight, as well as accommodating Jews. However, given the state of the kind of general world feeling, you can sit in the middle of the circle if you want.
No, I'm fine.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
So we're just looking at the first map, which is the 1947 UN partition plan. We haven't missed much. Yes, now the UN plan was far more Zionist than the Peel Commission plan was, far more in favor of the Jews. That was, of course, because of the Second World War, the Holocaust. However, before this partition, the Jews occupied only 10% of the land. So all of those maps we've seen in previous weeks showing the various kibbutz that the Jews are creating across the country. So only a very small part in the agricultural coastal plain. And they only made up 33% of the population. However, in the end, they ended up being given 55% of the land. including vital water supplies, most citrus plantations, and also the Negev desert, so this whole vast area down here. So they were given, in the end, more land than the Palestinians. This unequal distribution of land was to accommodate what was, the predicted mass immigration of Jews from Europe. They were expecting hundreds of thousands of Jews to come over from Europe as Holocaust survivors and so forth, and also from further across the world. Partition plans never work. They always go horribly wrong. They're horrible things. So what you see here on the map, the areas in blue. So this area along here is the coastal plain. So that was where the vast majority of Jews lived at that time in their various agricultural communities, whereas the vast majority of Arab Palestinians lived up here in the hill country, as it looked at in previous weeks. So in biblical times, this was the area of Judea and Samaria, where most of the Israelites lived. However, in these times, most of the Jews lived on the coastal plain, because when they first arrived, those first waves of Zionism, they were not interested in religion. They were only interested in sort of forming a nation and an agricultural economy. However, many Arabs still lived in the areas that you see here that are blue. There was no way to effectively draw a demarcation line between the two, so rough boundaries were drawn, as you can see on here, with none of them really being connected at all. One person, I can't remember who, described it as like two snakes entwining in a fight. They saw it was only possibly leading to conflict and destruction. Richard Graves, who was a senior British official in Jerusalem at the time, was very troubled during these final months of mandatory rules. The British were still technically in charge at this point, even though they'd pretty much washed their hands of the whole situation. And he described this partition plan as, quote, an experiment in anarchy. The British did absolutely nothing to implement this partition plan, telling the UN that it was the UN's proposal, not theirs, and that the UN must deal with it themselves. And again, the British wanted nothing to do with it, would wash their hands of the whole thing. We actually hoped that the Transjordan, so this area here, which would eventually become the Kingdom of Jordan in 1949, we'd hope the Transjordan would absorb the Palestinian regions in the east of Israel, and that would become part of Jordan instead. Palestinians, as they rejected the Peel Plan and the White Plan in previous decades, they now also rejected the UN partition plan. And significant infighting then began from 1947 and continued until 1948. So from November 1947 to May 1948, there was a conflict between the Yishuv, which remember was that preliminary Israeli government, and the Palestinian, Palestinian Arab Society, which was the kind of vaguely kind of governing body of Arab Palestinians in the land. And on the 15th of May 1948, after the final British withdrawal, so we left 15th of May 48, a regional war broke out between Israel and all of its Arab neighbors. So as soon as the British went, Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, Transjordan, they all saw this as their opportunity to fight for their Arab brothers and sisters and get rid of the Jews from the land. They all sent expeditionary forces. Even Saudi Arabia and Yemen dispatched a number of soldiers, and it was a horrific conflict. It ended in mid-1949, so it lasted over a year. However, Israel was the decisive victor. This was mostly because although all those Arab countries had sent lots of troops over, none of them coordinated with each other. I think there were 20,000 troops sent in, but they were all in different parts of Israel. They weren't unified, whereas the Yishuv, their defense forces that had been earlier ages, the Haganah, remember I said that last week, was now becoming the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. It was a lot more unified, a lot more well-trained, a lot more well-equipped, and there were 30,000 soldiers instead of 20,000. And they eventually managed to push back all of the invading Arab armies. And as a result of this, the new state of Israel pushed its boundaries during the conflict. So if you look on the map, you will see that although this was the proposed partition plan, that is not in fact what it looks like today. And what did happen in the end was the map that you all will recognize. I just want to make sure I get these boundaries correct. This is the more complicated one to draw, bear with me. I like to get things right. So much smaller areas given to the Arabs than was originally proposed. So in the end, what you see here is the State of Israel taking 78% of the land after the 1948-49 war. And this victory was hailed by the Jewish state as their war of independence. First, they'd thrown off the British yoke, British mandate was gone, and then they defended themselves from what they saw as their Arab enemies. 6,000 Israelis died, but many more Palestinians died than that, were displaced as well. So for the next 2 decades after this so-called War of Independence, the State of Israel consolidated its economy, built its society, and with all this huge amount of space, it continued to build urban areas, use the new land that it had acquired for their agricultural areas, and they prospered. The Palestinian Arab society, however, which is now confined to these 2 areas, was decimated. 750,000, so 750,000 Palestinians were dispersed into the surrounding nations following the conflict. They call this catastrophe al-Nakba, which is a phrase you might have heard of. And they were all spread out into various refugee camps in the surrounding nations. So if you look at this on the map, the red dots show all the refugee camps. The larger the dots, the bigger the number of refugees in those camps. 400,000 fled to Jordan, so the vast majority. 150,000 fled to Lebanon and Syria, and 200,000 were enclosed in the small strip of land near Gaza City. So the reason why Gaza became its own sort of distinct entity was plainly and simply because a huge number of refugees fled there in 1949. The Israeli Yishuv, the government, so it hadn't formed a parliament yet. That was soon to come. They initiated. Is everyone with me so far? By the way, yeah. They initiated a plan called Plan D. That's why they called it that. Whereby the Haganas, the IDF wasn't quite created yet, the Haganah were authorized to undertake, quote, the destruction and expulsion or occupation of Arab villages, which inevitably led to more Palestinian dispersion and deaths. There were still Arabs, obviously, living in various parts of Israel, but the Haganah were given permission to basically just go in and get rid of them all. It was horrifying. One particular, they were basically, let's just be clear, these were basically thugs. They were gangs going into these places. And one particular gang killed over 100 Palestinian residents, men, women, and children, in a village called Deir Yassin in April 1948. Yet, despite all of this, there was actually a huge failure of the surrounding Arab nations to help Palestinians. They didn't really do anything. Yes, they fled there. Yes, they founded refugee camps there. But the surrounding nations did not really want them at all. So the Arab world was changing dramatically at this time. We know that a lot of them had gained independence after World War One. Sorry, no, they didn't. A lot of them had gained independence from the Ottoman Empire after World War One, only to find themselves under the rule of Britain and France in the interwar period. Now Britain and France had withdrawn, and they were fully independent. At the beginning of the Second World War, in 1939, it was the old powers of Europe that started that war: Germany, Britain, France, Russia. By the end of that war, it was the new superpowers of the world that emerged: the United States and the Soviet Union. And so the Arab nations, they saw themselves as now being part of a kind of brave new world. they wanted to completely throw off Western colonial rule, and they saw all these Jews emigrating to the Holy Land as very much a Western problem, problem that the West had dumped on them. They didn't want it, and now they were even more angry because they had all these hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees living in their midst, disrupting kind of society and everything. It was, interestingly, the worst country for Palestinian refugees was Lebanon. They were treated as dangerous and unwanted in Lebanon. So it was a Christian government ruling Lebanon at that time, and they were worried that all these Arab Palestinians, the vast majority of whom were Muslims, would sort of damage the already very kind of delicate sectarian situation going on in Lebanon. Syria was a bit more welcoming, but not really. Egypt was terrible. They effectively used their military to block Palestinians from entering Egypt, and they kept them all in Gaza. So this border here between Gaza and Egypt has always been very heavily kind of closed off by the Egyptian military. Even today, we saw that. It took days and days and days for Egypt to allow those gates to be opened. There's two gates here, allow those gates to be opened, and Palestinian Gazan refugees to enter into Egypt. Jordan, which is now independent by this point, so no longer Transjordan, but the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. It was the only Arab nation to grant the Palestinians citizenship on the condition that they no longer call themselves Palestinians, but Jordanians. So Palestinians could go into Jordan, but they had to say, okay, we're now Jordanians living under the sovereignty of the Hashemite king. We're not Palestinians. Yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to ask, did they have their own, like, I suppose I'm only asking because they were a country for a long time, but they didn't very unified. Did they have their own, like, traditions and food, and, like, is there, like, a whole Palestinian culture?
No.
Or did it just not?
Not at all,
it's
no.
literally just like
It was just
nomadic.
various Arab groups living
Okay.
in the Ottoman provinces that is now Israel, Palestine.
Okay.
But there was no kind of Palestinian nationalism until the 1920s.
Okay.
Before it didn't exist. It was only when Jewish migrants came in that they were like, okay, we don't like this, we're being uprooted, so now we're going to call ourselves Palestinians.
Okay.
Before that, they never called themselves Palestinians. No. So the Hashemite king Abdullah of Jordan, he annexed. So Transjordan was still changing at this point. He annexed both the east and west banks either side of the River Jordan. So, and to explain to you, the east bank was an area sort of a bit bigger like that, and that became part of the Kingdom of Jordan. And the King of Jordan also annexed the west bank. So it's on the west bank of the River Jordan. So this became part of the Kingdom of Jordan as well. So all Palestinians living in the West Bank became effectively citizens of the Kingdom of Jordan. Does anyone know what the partition line was called? I've used the wrong pen. I just realized I should have used a different color. It was called the Green Line. Does anyone know why it was called the Green Line? Because when they were drawing the partition up after this conflict, they did it with a green pen. So for decades after that, it was called the Green Line. So Jordan controlled the West Bank, also controlled East Jerusalem. The Jerusalem is here. So half of it is on the east, well, a third of it was on the east side of this line. The other two western thirds was on the other side. And that was given over to the Israelis. But the Israeli capital at this point was still Tel Aviv. Is everyone still with me? Yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
So they got taken over by Jordan effectively.
Yeah.
What happened to Gaza? Were they just kind of like free
Gaza
roaming themselves?
It's kind of under Egyptian rule, but
Okay.
also not.
But they're not allowed in. They're under Egyptian rule, but they're not
it's
allowed
kind
in
of hard to
Egypt.
explain. Yeah.
Lovely.
Oh my God, I lost my place. Yeah, so the conflict ended, and King Abdullah was actually assassinated in Jerusalem in 1951. And in a few years' time, all the kind of old elite of the surrounding Arab nations, Syria, Iraq, Egypt, they all fell because they were too closely associated with the sorts of they've been too chummy with the old colonial powers and everything, and people didn't like them. So these old regimes fell, new regimes arose. The king of Egypt had been seen as someone who was also, closely associated with the British colonizers, so he was overthrown, and a very militant Republican president took his place. Do we all know who that is? President Nasser. So Colonel Nasser, who was a soldier who had fought and lost in that Palestinian war from 47 to 49, he now became the ruler of Egypt. So Israel's independence was declared in May 1948 by David Ben-Gurion. So just to remind you, Ben-Gurion, he was born in Poland in 1888. He was of that very early first wave in the 1890s of Jews who moved over to Ottoman Palestine. He was a very young man then, he moved there with his parents, and he was part of that Israeli kind of fight for independence for decades. And now finally, he'd achieved his lifelong dream in 1948 of an independent Jewish state. He was effectively the most significant leader of the Yishuv at this time, not yet the prime minister, that was a bit later on. But he effectively led Israel, and he declared independence. The US and the Soviet Union both acknowledged the sovereignty of the new Jewish state of Israel. And whereas before, by the end of the conflict in 49, there were 800,000 Jews. Over 3 years, that number tripled. By 1951, there were 1.3 million Jews in the state of Israel. So there were huge swathes of migration, as people had predicted. The 160,000 Arabs, so their numbers are getting fewer now, who were still living in the state of Israel, they were granted citizenship by the Israeli government, but they were effectively treated as second-class citizens. They were treated appallingly. They faced widespread discrimination and exclusion in the workplace. Sometimes they were kicked out of their houses to make way for people who just moved there from Europe, etc. So Jews were coming from all over the world, and every Jewish person had what's called the birthright. You might have heard of that. As soon as they entered Israel, they were allowed automatic citizenship with all the rights and benefits of an Israeli citizen. Half the Jews that were emigrating were Ashkenazi Jews. Has anyone heard that word? Yep, so Ashkenazi. So Ashkenaz was one of the sons of Japheth in the Bible, who was one of the sons of Noah. So you remember there's like a table of nations after the Noah story, isn't there? So Noah has 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham becomes the ancestor of all the kind of African peoples. Shem becomes the ancestor of Middle Eastern peoples. Shem is what the word Semitic comes from. Japheth becomes the ancestor of white Europeans. So Ashkenaz was who's one of the sons of Japheth, vaguely means sort of Slavic Eastern Europeans. Ashkenazi Jews were Eastern European Jews, Polish, Russian, Ukrainian, etc. Jews. The other half of the Jewish population coming over were the Midrashi, have I got that word right? No, Mizrahi, that's it, I always forget that. Mizrahi Jews, who were Sephardic and Oriental. So Sephardic means sort of Spanish and North African, Moroccan. Oriental, the ones that were from Iraq and Iran. And so they were coming from sort of the east and the south. Ashkenazi Jews were all coming from Europe, from the north. The Mizrahi Jews were actually treated not quite as well as the Ashkenazi Jews. There was actually quite a class difference there, whereas Ashkenazi Jews were often given, so there was an Ashkenazi elite ruling Israel. They were often given kind of like the new houses, and they were put in the newly built communities and kibbutzes, whereas the Sephardic and Oriental Jews, they were often put in the kind of abandoned homes of Arab peoples and things like that. So for a while, not anymore, it was made illegal in the 70s to mistreat them. But for the first couple of decades or so, they were kind of not treated as well. But finding work and housing from the hundreds of thousands of Jewish immigrants actually proved relatively easy. Their economy was booming. The government was able to create ambitious interventionist spending programs. They had lots of money pouring in from around the world, from wealthy European Jews, from the US and the French, who gave them money to boost their defense. There were also lots of West German reparations for the Holocaust. So Germany was two nations at this point, East and West Germany. East Germany under the Soviet Union didn't give any reparations, but West Germany did. So they gave lots of money to Israel. And then finally, the Knesset was formed, which is the Israeli parliament. So Israel, it just always seemed natural. There should be a democratic society, and they are very democratic. So they formed a parliamentary democracy. Wasn't the most smooth running parliament. There's almost never been a majority government voted into power in the state of Israel's history. They've had to always form kind of various coalitions and deals with smaller parties and things like that. But the biggest party at that time was David Ben-Gurion's party. He's what was effectively kind of a Labour party. So he's normally seen as the founding father of Israel, by the way, Ben-Gurion, and now he became the country's first prime minister. His politics has basically influenced the state of Israel right up until today. His policies have become known as Ben-Gurionism. So basically, he was very kind of proactive. He was a big believer in military defense. He established the IDF. When he wasn't prime minister, he became the defense minister. He was quite retaliatory as well. He believed in strong displays of defense and shows of force as a deterrent against the Arab nations that surrounded them. So if ever they were to be sort of attacked, Ben-Gurion's kind of idea was, well, you respond almost kind of disproportionately by attacking them 10 times worse than they attacked you, which is, of course, what we've seen in Gaza over the last few weeks. So that's basically Ben-Gurionism in working in effect. He also introduced national service. So, 18-year-old Jewish men and women as well, right from the start, were conscripted to serve 2 years for women, 3 years for men in the IDF before they went on to do their own careers. So, everyone with me so far? Yeah. Any questions? I like being asked questions. I don't like talking too much. So in the 2 decades that followed this independence and the end of that first conflict, there was much broader kind of instability because the armistice agreements of 1949 had kind of been left unresolved. All the surrounding nations, Egypt was becoming the most dangerous. All the Arabs in the surrounding nations were sort of looking to Nasser to unite the Arab peoples against Israel. And in 1955, this stalemate kind of came to a head in Gaza when 38 Egyptian soldiers were killed there. So Nasser sought to redress this, but he had other problems. He was creating enemies in the West. So President Eisenhower in America had desperately been trying to sort of befriend Nasser because he was worried that the Soviet Union would get to him. So remember, all across the world, there were Cold War fears of the world falling into either communism or capitalism. And Nasser was being he hadn't quite sided with the Soviet Union yet, but it wasn't very friendly to the Western powers either, particularly not to Britain. And eventually he actually signed a weapons deal with Czechoslovakia, which was under Soviet, hegemony at that point. And he also recognized communist China as a legitimate country as well. And then a few months after this crisis in Gaza, when 30 Egyptian soldiers were killed, something else happened, something very big in 1956. Do we know what that was?
Oh, the Suez Canal.
The Suez Crisis, yes, Suez Canal crisis. So the Suez Canal is here. It's all the way up from the Red Sea up to, what's it called, where it comes out of the Delta? I can't remember. So in 1956, in July, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company, which annoyed the French and the British very much because most of the stakeholders, shareholders, whatever you want to call it, in that company were British and French, so it affected our economy massively. And in the October of that year, when Israel invaded the Gaza Strip and then Egypt, Britain and France sort of took this as their opportunity to sort of reclaim the Suez Canal from Nasser. So we sort of joined forces with Israel and 3 countries, Britain, France, Israel, that coalition. We sent paratroopers into Gaza and Egypt, and then began this brief war, the Suez Crisis. Most of our military objectives were gained in the Sinai Peninsula, which is this weird sort of bit. So Egypt is mostly like over here, obviously, but this bit between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. There's the Sinai Peninsula. It's called Sinai because, you know, Mount Sinai, where Moses gave 10 Commandments, was down there. But before, so the Egyptians knew they couldn't really repel all these British, French, and Israeli troops in this peninsula. But they kind of thought like, well, if we can't have the Suez Canal, no one can have it. So they ended up sort of sinking 40 massive ships in the canal to effectively block it. So, you know, when I think it was a couple of years ago, that one ship sort of like got
Stuck
lodged
sideways
in it.
round, yeah.
Well, imagine 40 of those things. So it was really, really bad. And this sort of continued into another stalemate. The rest of the world was absolutely furious with Britain and France for doing this. They told them not to do it, but they went ahead and do it anyway. And basically, President Eisenhower rang up Anthony Eden and more or less threatened him and said, if you don't cut this out, we're going to, you know, put forward extreme economic sanctions on your country and make your life very difficult for you. So Anthony Eden had no choice, Prime Minister, no choice but to sort of withdraw British troops. The French did the same, so we sort of returned with tails between their legs. And that event is kind of seen as effectively the end of the British Empire. That was a source. World War II had really decimated our economy, our power across the globe. After 1945, lots of nations, one after the other, India and African countries and so forth, went independent. And Anthony Eden, I think, kind of saw himself as being, you know, the new Churchill. He wanted to do something really big and brave like Churchill, which is why he went to war in the Suez Canal crisis, but it backfired massively. He resigned from office, and that was it. Ever since then, Britain's never really been a world power. I feel like our government still like to convince ourselves that we are a world power. We still think that we have some
That's
sort
what Brexit was all about,
of,
wasn't
yeah,
it?
some sort of place at the world table, but we matter. We don't. You know, I don't understand how we're the 5th largest economy in the world. I really don't. It must be financial reserves or something. We
You can do anything with statistics.
don't do anything. We don't export anything. Anyway, where was I? Yes. But however, although Britain and France are humiliated, it was great for Israel. Israel managed to really kind of come off well because the UN wanted to keep peace between Israel and Egypt. So the UN began sort of policing the border here to protect Israel from any kind of Egyptian attack. Palestinian guerrilla fighters that were living in Gaza or this bit of Egypt here were kind of repelled by the UN from attacking. And Israel was allowed to use the Straits of Tiran and even sometimes the Suez Canal for their own shipments. So Israel came off very well. We, however, did not. Nasser was emboldened by this victory. So oddly, it was a victory for him as well because, you know, he fought off the colonial powers, Britain and France. And his popularity in both Egypt and in other countries boomed massively. Everyone looked to him as this kind of hero who was going to sort of, you know, take down Israel and restore kind of Palestinian Arab culture. However, he had lots of other problems because some of the newly created Arab countries were sort of progressive republics, like Egypt was becoming. However, there were also more conservative Arab monarchies as well, and they were kind of a bit of an embarrassment to him because they reminded some people too much of the kind of colonial powers. He wanted the Arab countries to be republics, you know, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Iran, they were all still monarchies. And Iraq as well. Iraq had a king at this point. However, yes, and he was also involved in a proxy war with Saudi Arabia. So he ended up committing something like 70,000 troops to Yemen to fight a proxy war with Saudi Arabia. So it was, I think it was to do with oil fields or something. I can't remember exactly, but he had a big kind of problem with the King of Saudi Arabia. So his sort of problems he was having with the Arab monarchies were preventing him from doing much in the Holy Land. So he was busy fighting a proxy war with Saudi Arabia. And then we come up soon to the next big conflict, which was in 1967. I'm just going to nip to Lou. Talk amongst yourselves.
Sorry?
A huge gap of line, which can make students and on the side of
I thought it was unknown whether the mother side was.
But they've done more digging and they found
They found evidence.
they found it under the blue. The mother also. Well, she's just actually so far.
So is she Jewish but not him? Her husband?
Yes, in his case.
Okay.
She goes.
Yeah.
So prior to the beginning of the 1967 Six-Day War, so this is like almost more than 10 years after the Suez Crisis, there were lots of Palestinian guerrilla groups based in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, and they were increasing their attacks, sort of sporadic attacks, little attacks, which led to sort of Israeli kind of reprisals that were very severe. But in November 1966, there was an Israeli strike on a village called Al-Samu in the Jordanian West Bank. It left 18 dead and 54 wounded. So this was the worst reprisal of all those guerrilla attacks in quite a while. And during an air battle with Syria in April 1967, so the following year, so it was happening, so Lebanon's here, this is the border. So the Israeli Air Force shot down 6 Syrian fighter jets. And in addition, Soviet intelligence reported that Israel was planning a campaign against Syria, which was not actually true. They weren't planning any campaign against Syria. So the Soviet Union kind of fed false information, which stoked more kind of Arab fears. The Israelis were starting a war against them. So the attack on the West Bank, the attack in Syria, and the Soviet intelligence led to kind of a real buildup of tensions, and people thought it was definitely going to be a war. Nasser had previously come under criticism for his failure to help Syria and Jordan with these attacks. He didn't do anything when they were attacked by Israel. He was also accused of hiding behind the UN's forces, which are stationed still at the border 10 years later, preventing Palestinian guerrilla attacks on Israel. But now, after the Soviet Union gave him intelligence, remember by this point Nasser was pretty much allied with the Soviet Union, he decided, okay, well clearly, I've got to do something about Israel. So on May the 14th, 1967, Nasser began mobilizing Egyptian forces in the Sinai Peninsula. And on May the 18th, he formally requested the removal, so he got all the UN people to get out of the way, force them to leave. So it says he formally requested in the actual, but he didn't really formally request, he just got rid of them. And he closed the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli shipping, and Israel were not happy about this. So there was an effective blockade at the port of Eilat, which is here in southern Israel. So Egypt stopped them from shipping out here. They got rid of the UN station there and began mobilizing their troops in the Sinai. So Israel were aware that something was definitely going on in Egypt, which made them very, very worried. And also on May the 30th of that year, 67, the new king of Jordan came to sign a pact with Egypt in Cairo. So again, more fears that something was being planned. What happened next was pretty stunning, really. The Israeli intelligence, they got wind that a massive unified Arab airstrike attack was going to happen. And they basically responded with a huge preemptive air assault on all of the Egyptian jets whilst they were still on the tarmac, just destroyed a lot of them, and then sent their air force to Syria and Lebanon. Did exactly the same thing, destroyed all their planes while they were still on the tarmac. So Israel basically took out the entire air defense force of the surrounding Arab nations before they even had a chance to attack Israel. So that was pretty incredible. And what was going to be this huge invasion of Israel, what was planned, ended up just being a 6-day war. So they destroyed more than 90% of Egypt's air force by this point, so they were completely incapacitated before they even started. And without the cover from the air, the Egyptian army, as they entered, was left very vulnerable to attack. And within 3 days, the Israelis basically achieved an overwhelming victory on the ground over here. They captured the Gaza Strip, and they actually, believe it or not, captured the whole of the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. So if you look on this map here, it shows you all the Israeli gains. So to the Gaza Strip, which led effectively right into the peninsula, we took all of that as well. What else did they do? It's been a long time since I've done this. Yes, that's right. An eastern front was also opened. They captured the Suez Canal as well, believe it or not. On June the 5th, Jordanian forces, so remember West Bank is part of Jordan, they began shelling East Jerusalem. And then what they did was the Israelis drove the Jordanian forces out of East Jerusalem and also completely out of the West Bank. So first they took Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from the Egyptians, then they effectively took West Bank from the Kingdom of Jordan. And then the last part of the war came in the north, when they took the Golan Heights from Syria. So the Egyptian attack had failed, the Jordanian attack had failed, and although by the time they attacked Syria, Egypt and Jordan had agreed to a sort of a ceasefire, the Assyrians still kind of held on, and they continued to shell villages in northern Israel. So they really were being attacked from kind of three fronts, but they repelled the attacks of Syria. So actually, if you go there to the Golan Heights, so I went there a long time ago, you can actually see the kind of the trenches from the 6-day war. They're still there, where the Israeli soldiers sort of hid in the very small, narrow trenches right against the Syrian border. So the Golan Heights were taken. So on your maps, you can see the Golan Heights. It's this on this map here in the top right corner, that green bit. So this, before 1967, was part of Syria. Ever since then, this has been part of Israel. So the Golan Heights was taken from Syria. So not only did they win the 6-day war, but they expanded their borders threefold, because they had the whole of the Sinai Peninsula as well. And Syria eventually also accepted the ceasefire on June the 10th. Is everyone with me so far? So attacked from three fronts, repelled them all, and even, they took the Gaza Strip, they took the Sinai Peninsula, they took the West Bank, and they took the Golan Heights. So, this was just an epic victory for Israel. Even now, a lot of very kind of nationalistic Israelis, they call it what do they call it? The glorious 6-day war, or something like that. I don't know. It's really seen as kind of a great day for them. The Arab losses in the conflict were disastrous. Only 700 people died in Israel. That's a lot, but compared to the Arab nations, more than 11,000 died in Egypt, 6,000 in Jordan, 1,000 in Syria, 700 in Israel. The Arab armies also, because of the bombing, suffered crippling losses of weaponry and equipment. The lopsidedness of the defeats, because it really was, so much in Israel's favor, demoralized both the Arab public and also the political elites of those countries. And Nasser, very shortly afterwards, announced his resignation, but he got back into power a couple of years later. Israel proved beyond question that it was the region's preeminent military power after 1967. The Six-Day War led to a real kind of increase in Zionism in the country, but not the labor Zionism of before, the more kind of nationalistic right-wing Zionism. The conflict created hundreds of thousands of more refugees. It brought more than 1 million Palestinians into the occupied territories under Israel. Also now West Bank, Gaza, from this point onwards became known as the occupied territories. So whereas before this was Egypt, this was Jordan. Now, although not technically part of Israel and mostly populated by Arabs, they were occupied by the Israeli military and have been ever since. So that's 50 years now. So months after the war, in November, the United Nations passed what was called Resolution 242, which called for Israel's withdrawal from these territories. It had captured in exchange for lasting peace. That resolution became the basis for diplomatic efforts between Israel and its neighbors. However, it didn't happen. Israel did not withdraw from the occupied territories, and tensions between Egypt and Israel got worse, with sort of constant artillery strikes between the two, and it was stoked by further kind of Cold War fears because the US backed Israel, the USSR, Soviet Union backed Egypt, and the stalemate ended. This was another stalemate with the death of Nasser in 1973. So Nasser was re-elected, but then he died in 1973. And another president of Egypt, President Sadat, came to power, and he launched an attack on the Israeli forces occupying the Sinai Peninsula. So if you go back to that map again, Israel was still in control of this whole peninsula until 1973. So for 6 years, that was Israel. So it was extremely big. Although hardly anyone lives in the Sinai Peninsula, which is a desert, but they still had that land. Yes, so President Sadat launched an attack on the Israeli forces, and also at the same time, Syria attacked the Golan Heights. This was in 1973, so they were attacked from both sides yet again. However, both attacks were unsuccessful, they were repelled. And then in 1977, President Jimmy Carter visited Camp David, you probably heard of Camp David, in the state of Israel, hoping to use Resolution 242 as a framework to bring about general peace between the Israeli and Arab peoples living there. So Jimmy Carter was the president who was very much invested in kind of trying to resolve the tensions and the conflict. He wanted the Israelis to withdraw from the West Bank and Gaza. He wanted Palestine to recognize Israel's sovereignty. So he really was kind of suggesting the beginnings of a two-state solution. However, all that was signed and agreed in the end in March 1979 was a sort of normalization of relations between Egypt and Israel. There was no formal withdrawal of forces from any of the territories. The main reason for that was the election of a new Israeli prime minister. So Ben Gurion, by this point, had lost power. Labor Zionism, so the old kind of, remember I told you at the beginning there are two main types of Zionism. Labor Zionism, where the Jews want to just move into Israel to create their own culture and society and economy. It was an agrarian economy and society that if they worked on the land, it would become their land by right. The other kind of Zionism was a very religious, messianic, nationalistic kind of Zionism, which since the Six-Day War, which a lot of people saw as kind of almost a holy war, like God was on their side, that it was restorative, they claimed all this land, even the Golan Heights and everything. And ever since the Six-Day War and the kind of the euphoria of that war that was felt in the state of Israel, the more right-wing religious parties became more popular. And the new Israeli Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, he had no intention whatsoever of recognizing Palestinian sovereignty. For the first time, he began using, for the first time in the Israeli government, biblical language started to be used. So he refused to call the West Bank, he called it Judea and Samaria, because in biblical times, as I've said in previous weeks, this was the area the Israelites mostly lived in, the hill country. So this area here is Judea, this area here is Samaria. So they called Judea and Samaria, they didn't call it the West Bank. And he said, the West Bank is Judea and Samaria is rightfully ours. We're not giving it back. In the Bible times, that was where our people live. That was our ancestral homes. The Zion, you can see how there was a huge shift now in Zionism towards a much more kind of religious rhetoric. And there was even the Golan Heights. The Golan Heights has here Mount Hebron, which is very significant in Israelite history as well. So the Golan Heights is even seen as kind of, in terms of religion and biblical antiquity, their rightful home. Ben-Gurion's Zionism, the Labour Zionism, was, as I've said, very different from Begin's right-wing Zionism. So Ben-Gurion, for instance, he was contented with the Israelis just having the coastal plains, because he thought, the coasts are very, what's the word? Arable, is that the word? Fertile, yeah. We've got our communities there, we've got our economic prosperity there. It's fine to just leave the Palestinians where they are. We don't need to take those areas, So he was quite in favor of a partition and Arabs having their own kind of area. Post 1967, the Meccan and Begin government was very much like those areas, of course. And there became a rift in the parliament at that time between the Hawks and the Doves. So the Doves in the Israeli parliament were the Peace Now movement. And they desired a fair resolution and settlement for the Arabs. They wanted to recognize Arabs' right to live peacefully in the West Bank and Gaza. So a lot of Israelis in the government at that time were very pro-Palestine and wanting to help Palestinians. So those were the Doves, the Peace Now movement. The Hawks, or the Gush Amunim, which means Block of the Faithful, they were the Messianic millenarian movement who wanted full control over the occupied territories. And it was at this time that Israeli settlements began to be created. Not so much in Gaza, but definitely in the West Bank. So many Israelis under the Begin government were encouraged to sort of move into the West Bank and set up, their own kind of various communities in the West Bank amongst Arabs. So everyone with me.
Why would they want to do that?
Because they wanted to live where their ancestors had lived. And using the agricultural practices in the coastal plain, they wanted to move here and set up their own sort of communities and everything. So whereas before 1967 as well, everyone was very content to have Tel Aviv as the capital. Now, in this much more kind of messianic, religious Zionist Israel, there could only be one capital, Jerusalem. And so the Green Line, which beforehand had separated East Jerusalem from West Jerusalem, this was completely ignored, and the whole of East Jerusalem was also annexed into the state of Israel as well. So there should be a map. Maybe there's not. So this map here, if you look at the kind of the grey bit here, that's East Jerusalem. So I just draw on this one here. So this here would be all of Jerusalem. Initially, Israel were only allowed to have the kind of the white bit, and the grey bit, which is part of the West Bank, belonged to the Palestinians or the Kingdom of Jordan. But they've now taken that whole of that East Jerusalem bit as well, and a number of Jewish sort of suburbs were set alongside it. However, Palestinians, interestingly, were not really displaced from East Jerusalem. Today, if you go to East Jerusalem, still loads of Palestinians living there now, especially Arab communities living there. So St. George's College, the Anglican Cathedral in Jerusalem, it's in East Jerusalem. It's actually literally on the street where the dividing line used to be. And it's all Palestinians, Arabs in that neighborhood. There's no Jewish people living there. And the Palestinians that live there, the reason they live there and they've never moved is because they believe that this will one day be their capital city again. Whereas the Israelis definitely regard Jerusalem as their eternal capital. But that's just the way it kind of goes. So yes, in 1977, Ben Gurion's Labour Party, the main reason why it lost actually was because it had been unable to provide any kind of clear belief about the settlements. So they were controversial to Ben Gurion, whereas Begin's government were like, yeah, the settlements are great, we want to support these, they're funded by the government, even today. So one time when I visited the West Bank, we went into one of the settlements. It was a really interesting little town because it's like a first world town. So the houses are really nice. There's the mayor's office, which just has like sort of glass walls and everything, and they've got all this technology and everything, and nice cars and stuff. And it's surrounded by these nearby 3 Arab Palestinian villages, which are just sort of in poverty. And we talked to the mayor. He's definitely a politician. He's quite a dangerous man. He's good friends with Netanyahu, and he was kind of like, but we give them water. We built these irrigation systems that provide these 3 villages with clean water and everything, which was perfectly true. They had done that, but they saw that as their kind of, their way of excusing themselves for just living there. But there are these settlements all over the place. So it began in kind of the early 1970s. And still continues today. So all these settlements have all been supported by the government, and what was also supported by the government at that time was the harsh treatment of Palestinians living within or nearby these settlements. So in the settlements, economic life for the Palestinians was severely restricted. Their agricultural land was taken away. Irrigation farming suffered because they'd taken water from them. It didn't allow them to even build wells, weirdly, in the places near where they occupied. And the reason they were able to do this was because the Israeli military were in the West Bank and were protecting these new settlements from any attacks from the Palestinians. The Palestinian economy, meanwhile, in the West Bank and in Gaza, started to suffer because they became increasingly dependent on the prosperity of the Israeli economy. Many Palestinians could no longer find work in the West Bank. So, as occurs still today, many Palestinians actually go into Israel to work and then come back into the West Bank at the end of the day. So it's very easy to get into the West Bank. All you have to do is that you just walk through like a door, like in the wall, like a sort of, what do you call them, the swing gates. You just go in, that's it, you're in. Getting out is very difficult. So I once stayed in, it was called, what is it called now? A Crusader fort, which was converted into a sort of Christian community, kind of about here, just outside the wall where Bethlehem was. Bethlehem's here. And we stayed, Tantor it was called, we stayed here. And one evening, me and this group of Australians who were on pilgrimage with me, we thought, let's go into Bethlehem and get some drinks, it'll be fun. So we walked through the wall, a door in the wall. It was pretty easy to get in there. It's really weird because 1 minute you're in like Israel, this first world country, and you walk through the wall, and then you're in a third world country, and you were hounded by all these Arab peoples trying to sort of like get us to use their taxis and things like that. They were all very nice to us. And we made our way to the walled off hotel, which is Banksy's hotel that he's purchased and built and everything. So instead of the walled off hotel in New York, it's in New York.
Yeah.
It's the walled off hotel because it's walled off from Israel and everything. And so that all the views of walled off hotel look directly onto the wall where there's all this Banksy artwork and everything. It's brilliant. And so we all had a bit to drink. So as I say, it was very easy getting in there. Getting out again was not easy. The guards made life very difficult for us. We 1 minute went into the wrong exit and they started shouting at us, waving their guns around. We sort of freaked out. And then my bag got stuck in the X-ray machine. And this guy shouted at me to put my hand in the X-ray machine to push it through. And I said, I'm not putting my hand in the machine. You put your hand in the machine. And they saw the Australian's passport and they were fine. They let them straight through. They saw my British passport and they got all iffy with me. And I was like, all right, you clearly don't like Brits then. So anyway, and just imagine poor Palestinians have it 10 times worse than that. And they have to do that every single day on their way to work. It's horrible. It was around this time that the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was created. And there were many sort of like subsets of this organization, the most famous being Fatah, which means conquest in Arabic. That's led by Yasser Arafat. Arafat was a very militant sort of member of the PLO. He started launching guerrilla attacks in the West Bank onto Israeli settlements, which was met, obviously, you can imagine, with extreme retaliation by the IDF. Fatah rejected all Zionist claims. They refused to recognize the sovereignty of the state of Israel. They said Judaism is a religion, it's not a nationality, go away. But these terrorist actions did very little to help the plight of Palestinians. It only kind of made international kind of view of them worsen. Palestinian groups actually even fell foul of surrounding Arab countries. So the King of Jordan still liked to think that he sort of owned the West Bank, though he didn't. There was an assassination attempt by the PLO on the King of Jordan, which failed. This led to many members of the PLO fleeing into Lebanon, which again caused problems because the Lebanese Christian government didn't really like these Palestinians coming in, disrupting the already kind of delicate sort of social equilibrium. The Palestinians eventually tried to assassinate the Lebanese ambassador to the UK. At that point, Lebanon became very, very scared, and they actually asked Israel for help against Palestinians. So this was an Arab country that previously tried to invade Israel. It was now asking Israel for help to fight off Palestinians living in their country. So there were Palestinian guerrilla fighters on the border who were sort of attacking Israel, and Israel took that and the assassination of the ambassador as an incentive to launch an invasion by the sea to Beirut, where they attacked the Palestinian Liberation Organization officials, and they won. Many members of the PLO fled. The leaders fled to Tunisia and to Syria, where they lived in exile. But devastatingly, they didn't stop after that, and both the Lebanese militia and the IDF attacked a refugee camp of Palestinians, where thousands of Palestinian men, women, and children were massacred. So that was a real kind of horrifying turning point in the conflict. The massacre ultimately brought about the collapse of Begin's government. Israel as a nation were horrified by the massacre. They were like, what have you done? The government sort of fell. And the PLO leaders in exile shifted their policy from one of attacking Israel to one of like diplomacy. They thought, okay, now we're going to try and create a two-state solution. So instead of having this big dream of all of that land being Palestinian once again, they thought, okay, we're going to have to just settle for two-state solution instead. And that continued for a while, and things stayed relatively peaceful until 1987, when the Intifada was created. So an even more militant Arab-Palestinian organization spearheaded by Hamas. So Hamas first sort of appeared in the early 90s and was suddenly more popular than Fatah, more extremist than Fatah. And as you know, things have continued to get worse since then. I don't want to go into too much detail about the events of the 90s and the 2000s, because I kind of feel like I wanted to cover kind of the earlier history, and I wanted to give some opportunity to have a conversation about what we've gone through before we all go away. Just to let you know, some significant things. The Oslo Accords in 93 and 95 were signed by Israel and the Palestinian Liberation Organization as a way of sort of just resolving some of the border disputes. There was a peace treaty between Jordan and Israel in 1995. The Israeli Prime Minister, who was the first left-wing Prime Minister to be elected since the 70s, Yitzhak Rabin, he was assassinated by an Israeli extremist. That was in 1995, and that severely hampered the peace process because he could have really gone on to do amazing things and create peace between Israel and Palestine. And then things got a lot worse in 2007 when Hamas were elected as the government in Gaza. Ever since then, the Netanyahu government has not been able to have any kind of effective talks with Gaza or West Bank, and ultimately it has led to the recent events a couple of months ago when Hamas attacked in this area here in the desert. 1,500, they killed 1,500 Israelis. As you know, the IDF responded in kind by invading Israel, and now, since then, 18,000 Gazans have died, including 7,000 children. So the conflict hasn't ended. It's got worse. It's going to get worse. But hopefully, understand some of the background and just how complicated it is, how it's basically just kind of a situation that's basically, it seems impossible to kind of solve. I've got another thing to say. So this is West Bank today. So for those of you who didn't know, the West Bank is divided into 3 zones. So Area A, which is the darkest bit, darkest color, that is the area controlled by the Palestinian government in the West Bank. So not Hamas. Hamas is Gaza. This is the Palestinian government in the West Bank. Area B, the sort of lighter blue, grey, that's controlled by both Palestinians and Israelis. And Area C, which is obviously, you can see, by far the largest, that's the area completely controlled by Israel. However, if you talk to any Palestinian living in the West Bank, they will tell you that it's all the same thing. That there really aren't any zones. It's all just controlled completely by Israel. And that's becoming more and more the case. The Israeli settlements in the West Bank are growing enormously. And there are now what's called outposts, which are sort of even more kind of sectarian than the settlements. So the settlements are always, internationally it's illegal, but they're legal in Israel for you to go join an official settlement. But sometimes you'll get the odd sort of Israeli person who will drive into the West Bank with a sort of caravan, set up their little homestead on the top of the hill, put the Israeli flag there and say, here's my own outpost, here's my own settlement, I'm going to live here now. And there's a lot of them going on. And often the IDF have to come in and just sort of quietly move these people along, but sometimes they don't. It's really mad. I mean, when I was last in Israel, I was talking to some Palestinians. They were telling me like they have things like, because their villages are sort of terrified by like Israeli teenagers on quad bikes and things like that. They get drunk and then just sort of, it's like something from Mad Max. They just go riding around, sort of like marauding and stuff like that. And but there are still a lot of Israelis committed to peace. They're horrified that their children have to join the military and might die in some of these skirmishes. They don't want this conflict to continue. No decent Israeli, and the vast majority of Israelis are just perfectly decent people like you and me. They don't want the war. They don't want the conflict. They want to just live in peace. But who knows where it will go? All we can do is keep praying and hoping. And here, some very detailed maps of Gaza and Israel, showing all the settlements and everything. So if you want to have a look at the magnifying glass to read the writing, but A3 was as large as I could print it. Oh, where's my other Gaza one? Oh, okay. You do have some the same one.
Gaza Strip.
You take the West Bank, and I'll get the Gaza. So it's-
Okay, I'm going to stop recording.